We need to make sense of the new study that shows Black African DNA that was found in England in two areas close by each other, but far enough that it makes it seem like there was a root inside of that area. Now, there are two things that we need to talk about before we read the actual study itself. The first is that North Africans in general entered Europe in multiple waves, and most of the people of North Africa had such ease of access to Europe that there is a back and forth genetically and historically between Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa, and the rest of Africa, especially when it comes to trade. In order to make sense of this study, we have to put it into the context of the kingdoms that existed at the time and the people who would have or could have contributed to these people ending up in this region, and why it is so surprising that it's West African DNA instead of East African DNA that is found in this section. As we read, West African ancestry in the 7th century, England, two individuals from Kent and Dorset. The authors are Duncan Sayre, Joshua Gretzinger, John Hines, and Michael McCormick. So, in order to understand what we are looking at, we need to first think about where these places are. Kent is located to the south of England, and it is in the coast. This is what we would expect if we are talking about a people who came from a foreign land and might have landed on the shores. It is typical in history for this to be true. Now, Kent, of course, is a place that even people outside of the United Kingdom know about due to important historical monuments like Dover Castle. The other one is in Dorset. Dorset is a less known area of England from people who live outside of England, and it itself is important as a coastal region as well. Now, we must remember that prior to these dates, the Roman Empire held a huge part of land. And just like the Islamic Empire that would come in the next 500 years after the Roman Empire, they only captured the higher parts of Africa. And so this cannot be fully the explanation for why these people are here. But as you can see, England, for the most part, has been captured, and the rest of Europe, barring very small parts of it, Asia in the West is pretty much under the control of the Romans. And then you have Africa completely free, except the North. Now, if you've ever seen any debates about what happened to the Roman Empire, what you will hear is two opinions. One, Christianity destroyed the Roman Empire. And the second one is that the Roman Empire transformed because of Christianity, which gave birth to what they call the Byzantine Empire. But this Byzantine Empire considered itself the Roman Empire, even though the Byzantine Empire was really a continuation of the Roman Empire. It's clear that their influence and power and their general land had shrunk dramatically. This transition away from England does not give us an excuse to say that people who were influential within the Byzantine Empire could not ship people all the way to England. Now, the Romans themselves did not leave a big dent in terms of population inside of England, as most of the people who were historically in that region remained even after the Romans. All of this information may seem somewhat irrelevant, but it's actually important to understanding the story of how this DNA got to this area. Now, obviously, the easiest way that it could have got to England is through North Africa, traveling by sea. And even though this is a likely scenario, While it's likely, this does not mean that it is exactly what happened. Now, keep in mind that obviously the most likely thing is probably what happens most of the time. But this very gene or genetic revelation shows us that what is likely does not always happen. Let's read the first paragraph and then we can speculate about it. Archaeogeneticists, the study of ancient DNA, can reveal powerful insights into kinship and the movement of individuals in prehistory. Here, the authors report on the identification of the two individuals with genetic profiles consistent with recent sub Saharan African ancestry, both of whom were buried in early medieval cemeteries in the southern Britain, focusing primarily on a sub adult female or a child, a girl, from Updown in Kent. The authors explore the societal and cultural context in which these individuals lived and died, and the widening geographic links indicated by their presence, pointing back to the Byzantine reconquest of North Africa in AD 533 to 534. So you can see there already the Byzantine angle has already been used up. And this is an important point because Byzantine, one of its great partners, has always been Africa, especially after a lot of the Africans, especially in the East area, were converted to Christianity. So the first part of the study itself examines the grave goods that are found before we look deep into the DNA. And this is important because all of these things have historical understanding and historical ties to both pagan and Christian history. This is one of the clues that will lead us to understand whether or not Christian Byzantine played a role in the moving of these people inside of England. Because, of course, it is more likely that a person who had a international religion could end up in an international area than that someone who existed in a local area just happened to move to another area and just be accepted by the locals in that area. So there is a couple things that's interesting about what is seen inside of the girl's grave. So of course we see the related individual, we see others sampled for DNA, and then the things we see inside of the grave: a belt buckle, a comb, a spoon, a thread box, shell, pottery, shears. I don't know what that word is. A seax, a knife, a spearhead, a latch lifter, and a belt. These, of course, have their specific meanings. Uh, I heard that these type of spoons have a Christian meaning. So let us continue to read. The phenomenon at population scales, concurrently revealing direct kinship between the individuals within the symmetries and in combination with stable isotopes analysis, identifying individuals, migrants, and their lifeways. The article discusses two individuals buried in 7th century graves near the south coast of England, at Updown, Kent, and at Worth Matraverse, Dorset. Both individuals had recent ancestors in sub Saharan West Africa. A complimentary article by Foodie et al. 2025 describes the context of the Worth Matraverse Cemetery. And so here we focus on the young female from Updown, as well as her grave goods and genetic relatives identified in the cemetery. The identification of these two individuals and the recognition of their assimilation into the societies within which they lived and died have far reaching implications concerning connectivity and their evolution of the early medieval world. The site contiguous areas of the early Anglo Saxon cemetery at Updown near Eastry in Kent were excavated in advance of development under the direction of Sonia Hawkes in 1976 and Britton Phillip in 1989. In all, 78 inhumation burials were uncovered, primarily from the 7th century AD. The grave goods from Updown comprise dress accessories, weaponry, and personal accessories, including objects imported from the Frankish continent and an unusual Byzantine buckle, antique when buried. Updown belongs to a cluster of cemeteries in East Kent and is only a few kilometers. So already we have three pieces of information that's important. Now, let me mention why this Byzantine ancestry is somewhat important, or this Byzantine migration route is somewhat important and keeps being mentioned. Even here, of course, you can see trade goods from Byzantine made it all the way to Kent, which is an already known thing. That's not new information for us. This box here, identified as ivory, is a box that was made by the Byzantines. This ivory comes from African elephants. The majority of ivory that ended up in the hands of the Byzantine that came from Africa came from Ethiopia. Not just Ethiopia, the country today, but Ethiopia, eastern side of Africa, which is why it's surprising to us that the DNA we find first in as far as this place that might have come from the path of the Byzantines would be a West African instead of an East African. If it was an East African, the story would be a easy one to draw. Some Christian from East Africa made his way to Rome or to one of the countries, North Africa, under the Byzantines. And from there, they went all the way to England. But with this type of DNA, we need to explore other marketplaces around the world, which would lead to such peoples ending up in that region. Tunis, which is historical to Berbers and other people of Africa, including the Negrits, as they called them in the past. These Negrit groups would be the Garamantes. Garamantes have been known, which were a historically black empire that existed with the Romans. So they communicated with the Romans, they traveled with the Romans, they sometimes took slaves of Ethiopian, even though they were Ethiopian themselves, and slaves of European origin. This is something that is written down. And so these Garamantes might have played a role in who ended up in this area. For many years now, scholars from around the world have been saying that West Africa is historically tied to North Africa and that there was no real barrier between the two areas, and that the people in North Africa have a vast or even a dominant DNA gene pool that can be found in North Africa. Other people argue this, of course, saying that the people inside of North Africa are unique in their make, and that the people who live in North Africa only had a minimal amount of West African DNA. Whatever the case is, it is not really relevant in studying this DNA. Whether it's a minority or not, in order to fully understand how it could have got there, it is possible that even though this West African DNA resembles a Sahel person or someone found in the Nigerian Mali areas, this person made their way in the early years to North Africa, and they might have not been in Nigeria or Mali for even hundreds of years, and they might have been stationed in the northern parts, possibly historically tied to the Garamantes. Before we look at the DNA, I think it's important to make sure we understand what we are looking at. So, of course, we have here the cemetery in the 7th century, and we see here figure 2, the cemetery at Worth, Matravers, and Dorset, showing the burial sampled of the DNA in bold figures. So this is the man that was buried. So the other one is in Kent, and this is the man. And this is the writing that comes along with it so that we can identify exactly who this man was and what he was like. And of course, the DNA results, which are going to be very interesting. From the large Anglo Saxon cemetery site at Fingalsham, from the Old English, that word, a prince's homestead, the place name recorded in the early 9th century charters identifiers Eastry as an administrative division, and wider historical evidence indicates that it was a royal center as early as the 6th century. The ancient DNA of 6 individuals from Updown has been analyzed graves 34, 37, 45, 47, 48, and 52. The detail of the results from grave 47 have not previously been reported because this individual's ancestry stood out as meriting separate discussions and contextualization. At Worth Matravers, a small inhumation cemetery of 21 graves containing 26 individuals was excavated by volunteers from East Dorset Antiquarian Society in 2011 within a multiple period site called Football Field, originally considered Roman, radiocarbon dated, and one copper alloy belt buckle identified in the cemetery as 7th century. The graves, all oriented west east and containing supine inhumation, were laid out in the 6 short rows and included 1 triple and 3 double burials. The only grave goods are a small copper alloy buckle on the pelvis of an adult female and a possible stone anchor used to pillow the head of an adult male in a double burial. The site lies around 2 kilometers inland from the English Channel on the Isle of Purbeck. The A-DNA result from 18 individuals from Worth Matravers were analyzed previously. Here we consider grave 1633B. So to understand which one we're talking about, 1633B is the one with 2 people inside right there. Let's zoom in. It's an interesting burial that there are 2 people inside. I'm not very familiar with multiple people being put in the same grave, especially in Africa. That almost never happens. So, except of course with kings who get buried with their multiple wives. But of course, what makes this one especially strange is that the person that he is buried with is another man. So, as we continue, Huddersfield sample KD010, genetic ID 111570, a 17 to 25-year-old man who shared a double grave with the unrelated adult male with the pillow stone. So that's interesting. They're not brothers. It's not the father. It's not a cousin or an uncle. These are 2 people who are unrelated. So it could be friends or even deeper than that, or they could be brothers in Christ if they're Christian. Kent has always been the conduit for influence from the adjacent continent. That was so marked in the 6th century that Leeds proposed to call this Kent's Frankish phase. Leeds 1936, 44 to 58, Sule 2018. Okay. Dorset contrastingly sat between the distribution of Mediterranean imports from the Atlantic trade routes and of Anglo Saxon burials practices before the 7th century. It was not demonstrably fully incorporated within the Kingdom of Wessex before the bishopric was established at Sherborne, formerly British Lamprobus, in AD 705, York 1990 to 136 to 45. Now, we must understand something about Britain or the UK or England, whatever you want to call it, in this time, which is the Anglo Saxons, which started early in AD, started migrating to these areas. These Anglo Saxons brought in what we would call Old English, a language that is Germanic in its origin. If you remember from the historical reports of many Romans and Greeks, people and languages from France all the way upwards to, let's say, the UK, let's just stop there, they were all somewhat related to each other, but different than those of the Germanic. The Germanic, though, that did eventually end up in that region, show us another thing. Another new type of people entering that region, which might as well have basically opened up the gateway to other foreigners entering. Now, of course, we know that England and other parts of Europe have had Middle Eastern influence for a very long time. And obviously, this one is not Middle Eastern, it's an internal European internal migration. But it tells us that Middle Easterners as well could have played a role in the movement of these Anglo Saxons. DNA can be somewhat tricky, and now we need to go and look at the DNA results that they provide. But we must remember again that DNA does not necessarily tell us where someone came from. I mean, to give an example, this West African could be a migrant from West Africa, maybe the Kanem Bornu tribe, or previous to that, right, in the Garamantes, and went and traded with the Eastern people, so East Africans, and then from there went through the European regions and ended up in England. The DNA only tells us what population they're related to, not what journey they took. And of course, rare things do happen. So, an impossibly long journey could also be part of it. So, as we read the ancient DNA was retrieved from the Petrus bone from up down grave 47, and it was possible to reconstruct approximately half of the genome from the sequence. Detailed methods, see online supplementary materials. Single nucleotide polymorphism coverage on the autosomal as well as relative coverage on the X and Y chromosome. Determine the sex of the individuals as female. Osteological evidence suggests that she died around the ages of 11 to 13 years old, as a very early death, but it's not very rare for ancient times. The maternal lineage of this individual represents mitochondrial DNA haplogroup U5B1, specifically U5B1C2B, which is common in Northern Europe. So, this is the interesting part, which is that this person is not 100% black. That is the part that a lot of people are omitting when talking about this, that this person is mixed, this little girl. And so she would have looked somewhat half the people, which actually happened a lot in England when there were black people, or in France where there were black people in that region. They would mix with the general population and you would get half breeds. Yet her autosomal DNA shows clear signal of non-European ancestry. Population genetics investigations through principal components analysis (PCA) and outgroup F3 and F4 statistics. Patterson reveals affinity towards present-day sub-Saharan Africans, especially West African, Yoruba, Mende, Mendenka, and the Essen groups. Now, I'll be the first to say I've seen many people already scrambling to say England was not a diverse population because you have one person. It's amazing how one piece of DNA showing one person can make people freak out so quickly. And of course, this does show that there was a level of diversity. Maybe they're not all were sub-Saharan Africans, but there definitely were people outside of this specific region who came in. Unless, of course, you want to speculate that only two black people came in and everybody else was native. Now, carrying on, analysis of DNA extracted from the Petrus bone from Worth Matrevis gave 1633b, or the man, resulted in similar observations, identifying the European U5b mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA haplogroup, and sub-Saharan African affinity on the autosomes. Both individuals thus show genetically and geographically mixed descent, with an estimated 20 to 40% ancestry characteristics of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, 20 to 40% is huge DNA. I mean, it's not 50% and it's not above 50 as well, but it's pretty big DNA. It's enough that a person you'd be able to physically tell that this person is somewhat different than the other locals. But let us not over exaggerate. It does not mean that this person would have stood out to such a degree that they could not blend in with the general population. Not that they needed to, because of course, a lot of the stereotypes about people that would later come hadn't been developed yet, at least not as dramatically as they would later. To explore potential genetic relationships between these two and other individuals from Updown and Worth Matreverse, the software read and IC MLK in were used and pairwise mismatch rates between the genomes calculated. No other individual at Worth Matreverse displayed a biological relationship with the individual in the grave 1633b. Okay, so that part is very interesting. So no other individual at Worth Matreverse displayed a biological relationship with the individual in grave 1633b. So in other words, the firstly, they're not racially the same. So the man in 1633 is racially different than every other person inside of the grave. So this black man is buried in a grave with white people, and these people who are all buried in one probably equals, and of course whoever the person that they buried with as well probably equals, have no relations to this person, and no other person has been found anywhere who is related to this person. Now, of course, the girl and this guy are related in the sense that they are both from Africa, but they are not, as far as I know, related to each other at all. Outside of that, they come from the same continent. But at Updown, two females are identified as second degree relatives of the girl in the grave 47. Let's first examine that in a different way, because the other one is a grown man, so it's possible that he was moving around and that he might have not started in that area where he ended up being buried. The girl, of course, the little girl, is buried with her relatives. What's missing, though, is her black relatives. The ones that are there are her white relatives. So let's read it again. But at Updown, two females are identified as second degree relatives of the girl in grave 47. In graves 34, grandmother, and 45, aunt. So her grandmother and her aunt are buried in the same gravesite. The male buried in grave 52 is a third degree relative, suggesting that the female in the grave 34 was his daughter, and the girl in grave 47, therefore, his great granddaughter. what's interesting, so let's put it into perspective. So over here, we have a grandmother, a grandfather, and an aunt present. A mother and father seem to be missing. The females in grave 34 was the daughter. The girl in grave 47, therefore, is his great granddaughter. The females in grave 34 and 45 also carried mtDNA haplogroup U5B1C2B, implying a single line of maternal descent. This suggests that the woman in grave 45 is a maternal aunt of the female in grave 47. The male in grave 52 carries the Y chromosome haplogroup EV13, which is unusual in Northern Europe and more characteristic of southern Italy and Balkans. So you can see there is already foreign, although not necessarily in Africa, but foreign DNA going back in their family line already. And it is starting to be tied in to Italy in general. Something that I didn't mention earlier, which I think is actually important, is that Istanbul, which was taken over by the Turks and called that, is historically known as Constantinople after Constantine, who started the, I'd call it Second Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. Now, of course, the question is there anybody that disputes this DNA evidence? And the answer is no. Instead, some people are trying to clean up and state that this type of DNA is not that significant or doesn't prove anything. This is perhaps the most interesting piece of DNA in a long time outside of that one that occurred in Egypt. So, this is the burial of the girl. And as you can see, it's somewhat shallow, but it doesn't seem to be unique to this area. And the description of her is near her feet was a fine wheel turned product. Comparable vessels are familiar in contemporary Kentish cemeteries, and most were imported from Frankish Gaul. The incised, interlaced, decorated decoration in the hands around the body of this pot is, however, unparalleled, and this could be one of the few specimens for which local manufactures seem possible. The comb, spoon, and knife were found by the left hip, and fragments of the sheet of copper alloy mounts may be the remnants of a bag within which these items were arranged. The knife is a familiar utilitarian item, but the other two objects have potentially richer implications. Now, of course, there's interesting information about the things that they were buried with. The spoons seem to represent a Roman Christian artifact, which we could read, but I think it's going to go too far away from the main point of this. So let's read this part, which I think gives us insight of the type of person that we're dealing with, especially with the little girl. When it comes to the little girl, of course, she's not of age yet. So to imagine her in her head, we're talking about a little girl who is part African and then part the rest, European, even though not necessarily the type of Europeans that you would expect in that specific region. She does seem to have a somewhat foreign European ancestry, foreign to that region's European ancestry, sort of northern ancestry. This part is a little bit important. So her African ancestry may or may not have been visible in aspects of her hair type. I think it's very likely that it was visible. It might not have been the most visible, just like someone who is like 100% African American. But if you see someone with like 20% African DNA, you could tell a little bit that this person is African. And of course, if you look at the person's grandmother or if you look at their father or someone, it becomes easier and easier to tell. While we don't have access to this person's necessarily black relatives that deeply, the people who lived with her, I assume, must have known who this person's family was. So, as we read, a fairly broad interbottle span of 24.7 millimeters in the nasal region could reflect African ancestry, although caution is essential in the respect due to the level of preservation, toponic changes, and the limited availability of comparable data. Nonetheless, the eclectic assemblage of artifacts that she was buried with embodies wide source of influence like her ancestry, the gathering of familiar objects for a unique context. This girl's burial imposed societal norms upon her that might be meaningful, comparable with pressures experienced by young women of African descent today. To finish off, of course, we need to look at the speculations and of course the reason why is it that this person is West African? Why is their DNA more related to West Africans in the lower parts? Why isn't it the ones that you would expect in the higher parts? For example, closer to Berber type North Africans. Now, there are people who talk about how within this DNA there might be some North African DNA, but of course, that hasn't been made fully publicly available. But let's look at a map here so that we can understand exactly what existed or who existed in the region of Africa at the same time. So this is a map of Africa, and in it you will see that there are several empires that exist. Firstly, the region which I am highlighting is the region where this DNA is historically tied. The green area represents the prior or pre Garamantian era. So the people who are Garamantes who extended to the north all the way to the south. The brown represents the Bornu or the Kanem Empire that would later become the Kanem Bornu Empire. And a little bit of it is too low. It would be in Libya as well, inside of Libya. The third represents free Berber tribes, which existed. So that blue represents the free Berber tribes. And that region, we all know historically, based on writings, was historically tied to the trade between the Ethiopian regions and Africa. The red part represents the other West African kingdoms that have slightly different DNA. And then the purple represents the area to which the Byzantines had friends. The Caleb, which was mentioned by a Byzantine author in the wars of the world that were mentioned in the day, Caleb was a Ethiopian king who worked with the Byzantinians, which is why it's expected that we should find an Ethiopian and not a West African. Even before Islam, the areas of African Christianity and the areas of European Christianity still were in risk of Judeo tribes and other religions like Zoroaster, and having companions and people working on your side to fight in your favor, like the Caleb who took over parts of Yemen and helped spread Christianity into that region. Unfortunately, that only lasted a short amount of time because within 100 years, the Islamic religion would begin in Saudi Arabia and spread quickly across these African regions and including the territories of the Ethiopians. It's a hard problem, but my solution to it is pretty simple. It probably has to do with the markets that existed in the Berber regions that I pointed out. And I think that people from that area are more likely to have planted or supplanted the DNA in North Africa, and then it went from there all the way to England. Looking at today's maps, what we see is the country of Algeria, colored in green right at the north next to Tunisia. This country would have been, at least the top parts, close and touching the Byzantine Empire. To the very south of this, there is a province at the bottom of Algeria. In this area, even today, there is a large number of people from Niger, Mali, Nigeria, Benin, who exist inside of the province, but it is historically known as a route straight into the marketplaces of North Africa. This large piece of land is called Tamin Rasset. Tamin Rasset, which is right here in the bottom, is one of the most studied areas when it comes to the greening of the Sahara, as there seems to be much exchange. Now, I have to state today there are giant markets in this area which have Nigerians and all of these people who sell the wares and also typical African stuff, which can be found to the north. Also, we find during the time, so let's say 800 AD, we find the Muslims talking about this area as an essential trade spot that connected multiple empires at the time. So it is possible that this region might have been responsible for this person being in that area. But I also think that it's possible that the girl and the guy are part of a much greater population that will be found later and show a significant amount of DNA inside of that area. Now, I want to say one more thing. So I find it funny that this one person that's found in Egypt has triggered some people to get really angry, which I'll react to that person in another video, where they lose their cool over whether or not this person should be considered black because they have European ancestry, which I find hilarious because there's people who that person would absolutely consider black because of the African ancestry, but that's for another day. This brings me to that conclusion that I made a long time ago, where people said populations don't move, they stay in the same place for a long time. Anyone who believes this does not understand humans. Humans are like water. We're fluid. In some parts, we're more like the ocean, moving back and forth within the same spaces. If you are watching empires move about, it would look like this, with these in and out rivers moving back and forth. And then there are parts that are more like streams, small villages. Then there are parts that are like waterfalls, where a population appears and then crashes on the rocks and they're gone forever. And then there are populations that stay in the same region forever and have been there forever. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and don't forget to try and read the article yourself, because there's a lot of information which I left out, and I will be reacting to other people reacting to this new DNA information.